In an article cited over 100 times on the U.S. National Library of Medicine, Michael Butler and Ruth Barrientos explain that the high rate of consumption of diets high in saturated fats, sugars and refined carbohydrates worldwide contribute to the prevalence of obesity and type 2 diabetes and could place these populations at an increased risk for severe COVID-19 pathology and mortality. South African Professor Tim Noakes, who reversed his type 2 diabetes by changing what he ate, has again called people to understand the benefits of looking more closely at what they eat. I spoke to him about his new book, Eat Right Revolution, and as a sports scientist, the upcoming Olympic Games.
In the United States of America today, 80% of the population are considered insulin resistant. 80%. And if you go down and you see people with an expanded belly, a large waist, they are very likely insulin resistant. And when I go around and observe South Africans, I notice that the majority are overweight. And they have what we call visceral obesity, which is obesity in the abdomen. And that is a high sign of insulin resistance. So you just have to look around and you will see the majority of South Africans are not healthy and they can't afford to eat the diets that you've suggested. They have to eat this diet. And so that's the problem. So I appreciate your point that there is individuality, but we've ignored that. We're telling them the opposite. We're saying you can eat what you like. Whereas if you're insulin resistant, and that's the majority of people, you can't eat what you like if you want to live a long and healthy life.
How important is this debate now, considering the coronavirus pandemic?
Yeah, thank you very much, because we know that the single most important risk factor other than age is visceral obesity. Visceral obesity caused by insulin resistance. That is the single biggest risk factor. Interventions we need to do to prevent the transmission of the virus had said your responsibility is to make sure you don't have visceral obesity. That's your personal responsibility. It's more important to you to do that than to do anything else other than perhaps taking vitamin D. That's what's important. And so what we describe in the book, we give the evidence that type 2 diabetes and visceral obesity are the single most important risk factors other than age, and that is determined by your behaviors. So again, as we're asked to do all these other things, we should also be asked to check our diets and get thinner and lose our visceral obesity. And that would have been a very important health message, which could have come out of this pandemic. Let me emphasize this point, that the organ that really kills you is your visceral fat. That is the visceral fat is releasing immune chemicals, and which are incidentally are what's activated by the COVID-19 infection. The cytokines, inflammatory storm, and that's what's killing us. It's the visceral fat which is releasing these chemicals all the time, day in and day out. And the only way to stop them is to reduce the size of the visceral fat. And you do that by cutting your carbohydrates and getting your blood glucose and insulin levels down.
From a sports science perspective, what is going to be the impact of the way that the games are going to be run on athletic performance? Because it is going to be quite different. There's not going to be acclimatization camps that are going to happen like we've seen in the past. There are going to be a lot of different restrictions. There obviously are those that choose to take the vaccine, those that choose not to take the vaccine, all of those kinds of things. So what is the impact going to be on Olympic performance and on athletic performance?
Yeah, I think for the world's best athletes, they will be able to cope with it very well. And because that's what they do, it's their business, and they will know how to adapt. And they've probably adapted anyway because they have been competing under these conditions recently. So I suspect that they will be able to cope, but it is very demanding. I'm just thinking about other examples. The Springbok rugby team preparing for the competitions, they're going into lockdown for months. Now, the fact is they won't see their families. So that would be a huge disadvantage. So yes, it's going to be very difficult, but always these elite athletes learn how to cope with it. And, world sport's all about your mind, really, and ultimately. So to get to the top, you have to have this incredible mental control. And the ones who succeed will be the ones who are best able to cope with the unusual circumstances of these Olympic Games.
So a big difference in the way that they're going to run these Olympic Games is the fact that athletes need to go to the Games and only stay for the period that they are going to be competing, so that there can be more space in the Olympic Village, not having athletes staying in Tokyo for a full 3 weeks if they're only competing in the very last week. So then, with that in mind, that athletes can adapt, do we make too much of acclimatization camps, and do we make too much of athletes needing to acclimatize to different environments?
Well, I mean, one of the problems in Tokyo is the heat. So that's going to be an issue, that you do need acclimatized heat if you're involved in endurance sports. Other sports probably not as important, but in the longer distance running events and the team sports, that if you've got a high energy expenditure, the heat's a big issue, and that will be a factor. But that would have been a factor whether or not there was lockdown. The other factors, that remains the most important variable, of course, nutrition. But I think that there's so much food available that you don't really have to worry that you're not going to get your type of foods there.
Yeah.
So then there's always the sleep, and there's the jet lag as well. That's a big issue because it's quite a big time lag, and so that the people who do best will be those who go out earlier and who are there for a longer time before their competition begins.
That's not really going to be the case for a lot of the athletes. What is the way that you would advise Team South Africa then to help deal with the jet lag?
Oh, well, they'll have experts advising them, but in general, there are rules about how you do it. The best is you must at least be one for each hour that you have to shift your time. You have to have at least 1 day of pre-acclimatization. So they will know that, and they will know that when you arrive, you have to do certain things. You have to change your sleep patterns. It's best even to change your sleep patterns before you leave, so that you anticipate the time of going to bed. In Tokyo, you start going to bed at that time in South Africa. Those are things that these teams will know all about.
Where do you think we're going when it comes to athletes' mental health and mental wellness at this present point in time?
Yeah, I think it's a real issue. I was kind of unaware of it, but a couple of cricketers started getting into trouble and acknowledging the problems probably 4 or 5 years ago. And they were high-profile cricketers who would suddenly leave a tournament and say, I can't cope. And having traveled with cricket teams, cricket is one of the most demanding emotional, mental, stressful sports that I know. It is incredibly demanding, so I can fully understand why they would have problems being away from their families. You need the family support if you're going to be exposed to that high level of stress every day. I think for the rugby players, they went to the World Cup and they were away for some months, and clearly they did fine, because it's a totally different stress. I would think that tennis is pretty much the same. It's this huge emotional stress thing, because you have to be focused, you have to be thinking every second on that. There's no time to rest, and it's also the opponent. You're winning or losing every day. You either win or you lose. So those are hugely stressful events. I think that fortunately, sorry, let me just say another point which comes to mind. Michael Phelps, the greatest Olympic athlete of all time, the most gold medal winner, has started a movement in the United States and in the Olympics, because he said he was considering suicide, and that this is the most famous Olympic athlete of all time. And he said, I just didn't know who I was. I didn't have any faith in myself. I didn't have self-belief. It's an astonishing observation by this guy, who was outwardly unbelievably successful, but inwardly he was very unhappy. And he's an astonishing athlete. And for him to have produced this campaign is really important, because it just does show that one of the points he made was that if I had an injury, I would have 30 doctors looking after me. But when I had a mental health problem, there was no one interested in my care, which is really interesting. So I think what you're saying is that by bringing the mental health issues to the fore, we're going to help these athletes in the future.
We started off the discussion about the low-carb, high-fat diet, and now that we're speaking about the mental aspects of sport, it brings me back to that question about, is intermittent fasting not the
the solution to all of our problems, regardless of what you eat. And you said, well, the problem is you'd never be able to get through intermittent fasting if you don't have a high fat diet, because you actually need something to sustain your mental capacity. So is it not a case of mind over matter?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, because, it's the ultra-processed foods. That's the real problem. And, we, vegetarians and vegans and the low-carb movement, we have a lot in common. And the one key is we move away from ultra-processed foods. That's the key. You've got to get rid of the sugar and the ultra-processed foods, and then you start losing this need to eat every few minutes. And that's what drives the instability. It's really interesting because we're talking about the mental side, but Phil Mickelson recently won the PGA at 50. And what did he do to get into this shape? He's just lost 20 pounds or so. And he used to be quite a large gentleman.
Yeah.
And he said, I started fasting. And in fact, leading into the tournament, he fasted for 36 hours. And this is a guy who's now the oldest winner of another sport which requires mental control, 100% mental control. So I would argue that getting rid of the ultra-processed foods and the sugar and the sugary drinks in the day has helped him hugely. And all of a sudden, after 30 odd years playing at top level, he's won a major competition again. And so that's a lovely anecdote explaining that if you're going to eat this ultra-processed food, you can't expect your brain to be working the best. You can't expect your mental health to be ideal. You really have to feed the brain with the food it needs, and it's not the ultra-processed foods that we're currently eating.